morning, everybody. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. If you could just do me a huge favor and type a little note in the chat box to confirm that indeed you can hear me. I've been having a little bit of difficulty with my audio. Oh, all right. It looks like it's working. Thank you so much for those of you who are saying that. Excellent. All right. So happy Friday. Here we are, Friday, June 12th, another week, and more that keeps happening in our lives amidst everything that is right now in the world. Really excited to have all of you joining me who have been with us before. We're also very excited to welcome those of you who are new to our weekly webinar series. We're going to dive right in today, and I wanted to just give you a little bit of an overview as to what we're going to cover. So we're going to be sharing an important reminder related to some announcements that we originally talked about last week. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. I'll be presenting today. And the first chunk of time that we'll be spending together will be touching upon these two issues, ensuring a successful return to work. And, you know, a lot of you have probably heard it affectionately referred to as reboarding employees, and then also some guidance for those of you who are really struggling with how to respond to the rising tensions that are happening in our society, which, you know, in many cases are beginning to trickle into the workplace. And then the last chunk of time we'll be spending together, we'll be reviewing some recently submitted questions and answers. I will share with you that the questions which have been submitted are very, very technical and have a lot of potential compliance implications with them. And I don't want to steer anybody in the wrong direction. So what I've done with many people this week who've been sending me very specific questions is copying the appropriate attorney for whatever respective state that they're practicing in on the conversation, and then having the attorney provide the guidance, just because so much is rapidly changing, and the last thing that any of us here at Decision Associates wants to do is to pretend that we're attorneys when we're not. So I'm going to share with you some of the recently submitted questions, and we'll talk through some of those answers. All right. So here's a little bit about me. As you can see here, this gives you a snapshot as to my experience, as to my credentialing, and as to the perspective that I bring to the material that we prepare for these weekly webinars. Aaron Phillips, who you see on the right, he is unable to join us this week because he is still enjoying a lovely, well-deserved vacation in the Outer Banks. Typically, Aaron says some welcoming opening comments, but again, he won't be with us today. However, I just wanted to share with you the experience and credentialing that he has so you can all appreciate if you should reach out to us during the week or for guidance outside of these weekly webinars. I want you to understand what our perspective is and where it's coming from. All right, so here's the announcement that I wanted to share with everybody. I wanted to just remind everyone that Friday, June 26th is going to be our final webinar, and I want you to all stay tuned because on Monday we're going to be sending an online survey to everybody past and present who has participated in our weekly webinars for the past 10 weeks. And we want to get your input. We want to firm up and actively define what our next steps are. And we want to lay out what those details are going to be. So all of those details are going to be shared with you on June 26th. But if you're wondering as to why, you can see it clearly explained right here on the screen in front of you. And also, you know, you can see the solutions that we're kicking around. But we are going to continue offering more support, more guidance. It's just that it's going to look a little bit differently because, as you can see right here, we feel like that we're moving into a new stage where employers really are beginning to understand the rules and how to apply them. But, you know, there is a definite opportunity to dive a little bit more deeply into issues to help you, you know, only pair up, I guess, or partner up with groups that work with us who are in a similar industry. All right. So here's what we wanted to talk about today. And I should tell you, I always say this and I forgot, I apologize, but please make sure if you have any comments, if you have any questions, please make sure you type it into the chat box or into the question and answer dialog box. And, you know, I'd be more than happy to address that at the end. So please, as a thought pops into your mind, please type it in there and we will revisit it at the end. All right. So let's talk a little bit about helping you to ensure a successful return to work for any of your employees who, you know, maybe you have employees who've been laid off. Maybe you have employees who've been furloughed, or maybe you have employees who've been working remotely, or all of the above. Whatever the case may be, it's really, really important that you put your organization in the best position to help their transition back to work be as smooth and seamless as possible. So a question that I wanted to ask everybody, you know, could your organization, if I were to tell you, guess what? Good news, I have a magic wand. The pandemic crisis is ending today. How many of you could honestly say that your organization can jump back to business as usual, whatever that is for you, immediately? I'm going to venture to guess that not very many, if any of you, could really honestly say, yep, I could do that immediately. Well, as you see right here on the screen, and by the way, the different states that you see represented on this slide represent the states that are represented by the organizations who participate in these weekly webinars. And if you're from one of these states, you certainly recognize it as being the plan, right? The plan that your state leaders are touting in order to get things back to normal. What I do know is that there's going to be a lot of aftermath. What we do know is that you and your employees have been working really, really hard to adapt to the ever-changing new ways of being expected to work. And we also know that the turmoil is rising for many reasons, and the disruption is here. And I think we all can agree it's here to stay for quite some time. And what that looks like, we don't quite know. So because of all of those factors, it's going to be very, very important that you help your employees return to work in the most thoughtful way possible. So we've prepared a few things for you to think about. And as you see right here, before we get into what to do, right? Some suggestions of what to do. As you see here, we want you to recognize and to remember in everything you plan and everything you say and everything you do, that your corporate culture truly is the DNA of your organization, without a doubt. So please don't forget that whatever you do is highly reflective of your culture. And furthermore, please don't forget that every single one of you on this webinar, because of all the things that we're dealing with, as we just discussed in the previous slide, every single one of you are having your cultures impacted. And your culture is changing in a way because you've had to change the way you work. Even if you're bringing people back, it's never going to be exactly the same as it was. So I want to make sure that everybody thinks about the fact that you really thoughtfully approach this in a way that understands and helps all the leaders in your organization and employees in your organization to understand that your culture is changing in a way in terms of its practices, but what is at the, in the fiber of your culture remains the same. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So here are a few things I want you to really think about before you jump right into a reboarding plan. And even if you're participating in this webinar and you're thinking to yourself, oh, shucks, we've already started reboarding and I haven't necessarily done these things, that's okay, because you can still make better decisions tomorrow, right? So please don't think, oh, it's too late, I can't do any of this. You definitely can. And first and foremost, obviously, all of us have a moral, an ethical, and a legal obligation to make sure that our employees are kept safe. And not just our employees, but our customers, our clients, whoever it is that our patients, whoever it is that we serve, right? So keep in mind that whatever your plan ends up looking like, safety is, the top priority. I can't tell you how many examples I've heard, and there's one particular, individual that I was working with this week who said, gosh, and they happen to work in New York State. And they said, gosh, I'm back to work. I just returned back to work this week. I'm the only one who's wearing a face mask. Nobody in the workplace is wearing a face mask. The guidance that they wrote down and provided to us was very, very weak. I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do to keep myself and my customers safe. So don't do that, okay? You have not only a legal obligation, but put yourself in the shoes of your employees and your customers. You have a moral and ethical obligation. In addition to that, you want to really think through in a thoughtful way who to bring back and when. I can't tell you how many clients we've spoken with who've said, okay, it looks like we're moving to the next phase in whatever their respective state is. And you know what? We're just going to open the floodgates wide open and bring everyone back because we can. Well, wait a minute here, right? So let's not just think, okay, it's like a switch and we can just bring everyone back. That's not the case. You want to take a look at who holds your most mission critical roles in terms of who must be physically on site in order to, keep things humming along in your organization as effectively as possible. Who has a position that can only be performed on site? Okay, well, naturally, those are the people you undoubtedly want to bring back. Okay, but then take a look at other roles, such as you have people in traditional sales roles where they've had to, go and visit on site with customers, clients, where they've had to have very, physically customer interfacing type interactions. Well, take a look at those roles, because guess what? They're going to need to evolve. And you're also going to find, which we'll get to, at another time, you're also going to find that, and as hard as it is, some of the skill sets that you require of people in the sales roles, now that it's going to be on a more virtual basis because of travel restrictions, your customers' hesitancy to allow on-site visits, and everything that's happening right now, you're going to need different skill sets from people, right? So maybe you have sales representatives who do a fabulous job face-to-face, but you have to make sure that you can either train them to get where they need to be able to do their job effectively in a remote environment, in a virtual environment, or look at upscaling your sales force to be able to meet that need. You also want to take a look at who's been the most productive while they've been working remotely. I know here at Decision Associates, we've really tried to follow that practice. And again, just because technically everyone can come back doesn't mean it's the safest thing to do. So we have looked at who is able to be very productive while working remotely. And you know what? If they're able to be productive, keep them working remotely, because that can only ensure the safety of your workplace, and you're not rolling the dice as this COVID-19 pandemic continues to unfold. So again, think through in a thoughtful way who to bring back and when. And then last but not least, we want you to really think about what your employees need from you. And as you're thinking about that, remember, some of your employees are literally unable to return. For example, maybe they have medical reasons, maybe they have childcare, issues. Some can return in a literal sense, but they're highly reluctant. And some are saying, when can I sign up? I want to get back. I'm sick and tired of being home. So you have people all over the place in terms of where they're at, in their interest level or capability to return. Make sure that you over communicate to your employees. And when I say over communicate, what I'm talking about is, and we're going to get to this in a couple slides here, but what I'm talking about is make sure they understand what it means to them, what it's going to look like for them, what it's going to look like for your company and your organization as they are reacclimating themselves to how your organization needs to operate now, right? Because nobody is operating exactly how they used to before COVID. So make sure you not only over communicate this to them, and even if you said it once, even if you sent out a memo one time, make sure that you continue to reiterate it, because it's a lot for them to take in. So give them the time to take it in and give them the time to adjust to it. All of your employees, just like all of us on this webinar, adjust to change differently. We respond to and react to and feel differently about change based upon experiences we've had in our lives. So be sensitive to that, over communicate it, and give them the time they need. And then last but not least, make sure you have two-way communication. Make sure you have that woven into whatever your reboarding plans are. And what I mean is, don't just tell them how it's going to be and move on and assume everything's fine, but give them opportunities to provide ideas, suggestions, ask questions, share their concerns, and be prepared for an increase in the concerns being raised. Because again, this is different, this is new. Everyone responds to and reacclimates to things differently. So it's going to be really important for you to enable consistent two-way communication so that things can go as smoothly as possible. And don't forget, your employees are on the front lines, and they probably are going to have some really good ideas or observations that can help you. Whatever it is your reboarding plan looks like, don't be married to it so firmly that you refuse to consider making adjustments as are sensible while you go through this. All right. So here are some things that we want you to think about, because as we just said in the previous slide, essentially what's happening is, although the thread of commonality in terms of what's at the root and at the core of your culture will remain the same, the cultural norms in terms of how you operate are going to change. They are changing. Okay, so when you are reboarding your employees, sure, I could give you a step-by-step plan of this is what you do, here's a policy that you include, but we don't want to do that for the purpose of today's webinar. Certainly we can help you with that, and we have been helping clients with that, but on a larger scale, we want to make sure you are keeping at the front of your mind, and whatever your reboarding plan looks like, we want you to think about how you can most effectively welcome them into the new cultural norms, because remember, what is at the root of your DNA as an organization? It's your culture. And if you don't have a strong organizational culture, you've really, gotten yourself into a bad spot. So first and foremost, because safety is first, it's going to be really important that your reboarding plan includes making sure every single employee understands the safety protocol that needs to be followed. And think about it. It's important, right? Whenever you have a new hire, what do? You give them an orientation. Well, don't think that that's not important now. And even if you have people who've come back, it's not too late. Have some sort of a reboarding orientation meeting that explicitly explains the new cultural norms. And when I'm talking about new cultural norms, I'm talking about different changes to the meeting format and what that's going to look at. So maybe you'll have some people joining the meeting who your regularly scheduled meetings who have to join virtually. Maybe you have some people who are rotating schedules to keep things staggered, and what will that look like? Maybe you, instead of having a large group of employees in the same room, you're going to have to break it up so that there can be appropriate distancing, and you have to have the same meeting 3 different times in order to accommodate the message being sent to all the different people. Whatever that looks like to you, make sure you thoroughly explain in this orientation for your reboarding what the new processes and policies and practices are going to be, and what that looks like, and what they can expect. You also want to make sure you prepare ahead of time by taking a fresh look at your policies, writing them to describe what your employees are going to need to do differently on the job in this new normal. And I'm a huge fan of scheduling listening sessions. You get so much out of them. And a listening session is basically, it's a fancy way or a cute way of saying, you're going to do a focus group. But essentially what I think is really important is coming up with 2 or 3 questions, having it guided, right? So it's not just a free-for-all where you just sit there staring at them and wait for them to speak, but have 2 or 3 questions that are important to you to ask your employees, and make sure they're open-ended, and give your employees a chance to have a voice about the pandemic, have a voice about ideas they have a voice about how it's impacting them and their ability to do their job. Give them a voice to talk through what would be helpful for them, so that they can be as effective as humanly possible in their respective roles, and open the lines of communication with your employees, not only between leadership and your employees, but also with your employees to hear the thoughts of their peers. Huge fan of listening sessions. Very, very important. I would highly encourage you to do this, because with that information, instead of waiting for something to brew into an issue, you're really catching it at the pass and making sure that you can stay on top of things. Also, it's very, very important to put in place some sort of a formal way of making sure you have employees feeling connected, and making sure you have employees who can serve as encouraging mentors to one another. So how can you do that? Come up with a creative way to put together a buddy system, and maybe you have 2 mentors or 3 people who are buddied up with each other, and they can be a supporting resource to one another, to work through and encourage one another as they're trying to settle into everything. Also, too, think about the fact that it's going to be really, really important to have transfer of knowledge and learning. There needs to be learning activities to help everybody understand what they need to do differently, and also it helps them to connect with one another. So find a way to schedule those. Always make sure that you communicate and recommunicate again your overall organizational goals. You want to make sure, as everything else changes around them and needs to be adjusted while all of this unfolds, the things that will remain the same are your overall organizational goals. Very, very important you communicate those throughout your reboarding process, because that will make sure that people are, as I like to say, singing from the same hymnal, and keeping that at the top of mind in whatever their practices are. You also want to make sure, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that the people in leadership roles have the skills they need to lead effectively in the new normal. I'm very concerned that, very concerned actually, that there are organizations who are just throwing their leaders in a situation where they're just expecting them to figure it out on the fly. It is so important, and there are a lot of different options to make sure your managers have the skills they need. There are a lot of different, virtual training options. I know we offer them. I'd be happy to talk with you if for whatever reason you want to do something different. There are a lot of other providers we could, help you to get in touch with. But whether it's in-person training, virtual training, remote learning, whatever it looks like, organizations such as ours can help you to make sure that you are positioning your leaders to be in the best possible spot to lead effectively. And, one example would be helping them to learn how to manage change. If you have a leader who has no clue how to manage change, then you're basically going to not only be setting them up for frustration, but setting your employees up for a lot of disappointment, and most importantly, negatively impacting your bottom line as you try to continue providing service to your clients, customers, patients. Make sure your employees have the training they need, and make sure that you really reward those who are performing in the best way possible. So those are the things that I really wanted you to think about. And those are the things, as you are reboarding your employees, that it's really important to incorporate. Now we're going to transition a little bit and talk about the rising tensions in the world, which I'm sure for many of us are beginning to trickle into the workplace. We want to make sure, because there is very little guidance related to this that is out there. And we want to make sure that we help you to be in a position where you're not caught off guard. So here you see in front of you, look at all these things that are happening. There are all sorts of, protests, riots, the pandemic and the pandemic response, which, by the way, varies by state. And also we have, of course, politicians duking it out, both on TV as we see it in the 24-hour news cycle, as well as on social media. We have people just ranting and raving, depending on what their stance is on social media about how things are being handled. It's crazy. We have, of course, political concerns, racial issues. What we know is that we are experiencing a huge loss of productivity, not only in our personal lives, but certainly in the workplace. We're also experiencing, rising tension, both in society as well as in the workplace. We are experiencing a lack of focus. It's tough to stay focused when all of these things are hitting us. We are experiencing varying levels of discouragement. We are experiencing varying levels of acting out and bullying behavior. And I should have also included, we're also experiencing an uptick in domestic violence. We're experiencing an uptick in, difficulties with substance abuse, alcoholism. And why do I mention that? Because who do you think is experiencing this? Your employees, right? So we want to make sure that you are in a position to know how to handle it. And I know we touched upon a little bit of this last week when we had our guest presenter, who is a mental health expert. But it's really important to make sure that you are, in the best position to respond. So here are the things that we've put together for you. First and foremost, as with anything in life, it always helps if you're proactive. So the old adage of being the change you want to see in the world definitely applies here. We want you to model whatever behavior it is you want to see. If you're running around ranting, if you're running around spouting your, personal beliefs as it relates to what's happening in the world and how it's being handled, you better believe you're going to see the same thing reflected back at you in terms of how your employees are interacting with each other. If you don't want to see that, then don't model it. You also want to make sure that you are reminding your employees that first and foremost, respect of one another needs to be a top priority, and you need to share and, oh, by the way, live by your core values as an organization more so now than you ever have before. You also want to make sure that you are not only keeping an open ear out for the type of chatter that's happening, but you also want to make sure you and your leaders who work for you are encouraging open communication. Open communication between employees, open communication between leaders and employees, but it's important that everybody understands something called media burnout. And maybe you could even share some helpful tips with your employees about what they can do to prevent that. And there's not just media burnout, there's social media burnout. So it might be helpful as part of your wellness programming to share some helpful resources to guide them through this. So be proactive. Don't wait for the issues to present themselves, but be proactive to prevent it. I also want to share with you, I'm not going to share what client it was because, obviously we have client confidentiality that we honor, but I want to share with you an example of some communication that I helped to craft, for a client who really felt strongly about trying to be proactive to prevent issues in response to everything, but they weren't quite sure where to start. And I'll share with you not exactly what they first sent to me as a draft that they put together, but I'll share with you just some things that I observed. And some things that I observed in the draft that they had put together is it was coming from a good place, and they were certainly wanting to convey that, that they, as owners of this organization, respected their employees and cared very much about the impact this may be having on them. However, what they unintentionally did was, in their wording, potentially, it could have caused some employees to think that they were, trying to insert some of their opinions or observations into what's happening. And we all know that as you're trying to be proactive in your messaging, it's really, really important to try to be as inclusive as possible. So what I thought I'd share with you is some wording that I had put together just to help them as they were trying to navigate this. And I'm sharing this and reading it word for word for you because it can help you if you choose to have some sort of formal communication sent out. It can help you think about, the angle you want to take. And again, keep in mind, it's important to be as inclusive as possible. You don't want to take one stance versus another, because you have to understand that the people that work with you or for you, they represent all different ends of the spectrum and everything in between in terms of how they perceive what's happening. So here's what I had put together. The recent death of George Floyd struck a chord and sparked protests around our nation. Some of these protests have taken on a level of violence, while some have remained peaceful. But the message is clear. A historic moment is upon us. We want you to know that as a member of our organization and as a member of our family of employees, we care deeply about your personal well-being and your diversity of thoughts, feelings, experiences, and contributions. We believe that every voice has a right to be heard and respected in a way that leaves no room for mistreatment of others who look, feel, or act differently than us. As an organization, we are committed to continuing to lead by example in the way that we trust in and live by our organizational values, which drive our interactions with each other and the customers we serve. So I wanted to share that once again, just because it's a one possible way where you could be proactive. I'm not suggesting that everyone goes out there today and releases some sort of formal communication. In fact, I think you should really think twice before doing it, because you want to be really thoughtful of what your intended outcome is. And you might want to sit on it for maybe 48 hours or so, or over the weekend before you release communication. But I also know that some of you feel compelled to do it, and you're going to. So I'd rather provide you some examples of guidance to put you in the best possible position so as to be inclusive for all of your employees. All right. The second thing we want to, give you to think about as you are figuring out how to respond to rising workplace issues is it's important to remind everybody of the rules, right? I think it helps prevent chaos when everyone knows the rules of engagement. So make sure, don't schedule a special meeting about it, but at one of your regularly scheduled meetings, remind your employees that you as an organization, you as a leadership team, you have values. Remind them of what those values are. I'm going to assume that most of you have mutual respect as one of those values. And guess what? If you don't, maybe now's the time to include that, right? This would be a great time to include it. And make sure, whatever you do, that you remind everyone that mutual respect is something you value and expect. Make sure that you reiterate that discrimination, harassment, retaliation, it never has been tolerated. It never will be tolerated by your organization. And I think it's very healthy to explain that political discussions, they really belong best outside of the workplace. Now, you want to be mindful of how you navigate some of what you say, because you don't want to infringe upon their rights. And we can talk about that. If you have any specific questions, please reach out to me and I will be more than happy to answer those questions for you. But it's certainly fine and safe for you to say, hey, you know what? It's best to have political discussions outside of the workplace. And why is that? Well, because we want to make sure that, you know, we don't say or do anything unintentionally that negatively impacts our working relationships here. And encourage employees to talk with you, to talk with the leadership if they're feeling stressed out, if they're feeling overwhelmed. And for those of you who are kind of at a loss for words of what to say, if someone might question you about why you haven't said this or why you haven't done that in response to everything that's happening in the world, I have here for you something that you could take, and that is just explain to them, listen, we don't want, as an organization and as owners, as leaders, as HR leaders, whatever your role is, as executive directors, we certainly don't want to suppress the conversations our employees have, but we really want to make sure that we caution everyone against getting into emotionally charged, you know, conversation that could really potentially get out of control and disrupt what we're trying to do here and negatively impact the great relationships we have. So that is a way that you could explain it, that certainly, you know, no employee of yours in their right mind is going to say, how dare they say this? So you see, you're explaining your organization's stance and where you're coming from in a way that's inclusive of everybody, but also, very importantly, in a way that keeps your organizational operations at top of mind. Last but not least, make sure whatever issues do bubble up and whatever issues do arise, make sure that you resolve them very, very fast. So again, if you are noticing, if you're hearing, if you're recognizing that tension is beginning to rise, or if you observe that someone's acting or behaving or speaking in a very aggressive or disrespectful way, you want to act quickly and consistently. And I can't emphasize enough, if you ignore these early rumblings because you'd rather avoid addressing it, or you'd rather avoid conflict, or you don't quite know what to say, they will grow into an ugly monster. So again, I'm sure all of you on this call, all of you on this webinar right now have people whose opinions you respect, who have great perspectives that you could learn from. Tap into them as a resource and have them guide you in terms of how to address it. Or, of course, you all know by now, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to Erin, you can reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to provide you guidance throughout the week, as we've done for so many of you these past 10 weeks, and we'll help you with that. But whatever you do, don't turn a blind eye and hope that it goes away. I think that's a very dangerous stance to take. All right, so I think we're ready to transition to the question and answer part of this. And I'm sharing with you the two different questions that were submitted in advance. And I will tell you, for each question, these particular employers who gave permission for us, I should tell you, to share their question for the purpose of everybody learning from it. These particular employers, I put them in direct contact with Mark Kuhar, who is the Pennsylvania attorney based out of Erie, that, as you know, we've been featuring on a bi-weekly basis for the live Q&A. And his answer is the answer that will be reflected in the following slide that I'll be showing. I also want to make sure that I explain to you, this is not to be considered legal advice. The only way you can truly get legal advice is by engaging directly with a qualified attorney in your respective state of operation. However, it does certainly provide some guidance and helps all of us to understand, you know, different options of what we can do and what we should consider. All right, here's the question. I need help understanding where we stand as an employer. I have an employee who's over 65 who works part-time. The original doctor slip that he provided was dated 4/21/20, and it stated that he should not work due to his advanced age. He was not eligible for the leave because it was only for a precaution. He chose to use all of his PTO before being furloughed. His furlough officially started on May 16, 2020. We contacted him because we need him back to work, and he provided us another doctor slip today that stated he would benefit from being absent from his current position with your organization until the threat of COVID-19 has plateaued in our county, and that you have no cases within your organization or with any of your residents. Here's the question. Do you have any recommendations? Should we just keep him furloughed? If we call him back and he doesn't work, can he collect unemployment? All right, so here's the answer that was provided by attorney Mark Kuhar. Be careful. If such a person were told to quarantine, as opposed to just being away from work, it definitely would be FFCRA, which of course stands for Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It would be considered emergency paid leave, even if it were just a preventative. So once again, if he were told to actually quarantine versus just to be away from work, it would easily be considered FFCRA. So here are the two questions. Question one, should we just keep him furloughed? As Mark said, probably. Your only other option that would really be apparent would be to discipline or terminate him, which Mark advised against doing. The next question, if we did call him back and he doesn't return to work, can he still collect unemployment? So keep in mind, this particular employer is in the state of Pennsylvania. And Mark's answer was, it depends on how he presents himself and which person reviews his claim. The Pennsylvania Unemployment Compensation System has a chart that says generally no. However, even if he were to collect unemployment, you as an employer would not be charged for it. The main difference between a note that says an employee must be away from work and quarantine is what they're doing. For example, if they're holed up, not going out, and away from work, that would be FFCRA leave, if and only if it were recommended by a doctor. If they're only away from work, but they're shopping at Walmart or going out and about, that's definitely not a quarantine. So in other words, bottom line, if your employee were told by a medical professional to quarantine, that would be considered FFCRA. If your employee were told, hey, it's best that you're away from work, and they have a note such as, provided by a doctor, such as what I just shared on the previous slide that this particular employer shared with us, that would not be considered a quarantine. Instead, they are simply away from work, but they can still be out and about doing other things. And that would not be covered under FFCRA. But please remember what Mark said. He is not recommending that it's a great option to consider to discipline or terminate him. All right. So the next question is shared by an individual who, if you give me one moment, this individual actually has offered to share their response, and they're going to explain it verbally. I'm not going to identify who this person is. I'm not going to, identify the organization's name, but I've kept this very anonymous. They have spoken with Mark, who gave them guidance as to how to handle it. And again, this particular individual has agreed to explain the guidance that they received for everyone. So if you give me one moment, I know this individual is on this call right now, and I am going to pull them up. So bear with me one moment. I'm going to unmute them. Okay. So I'm actually going to, oh, okay, I apologize. I guess they're not on this call, but I'll share with you the question that they asked, and what I'll do is next week, actually, we are going to be having the live Q&A with our Pennsylvania and New York labor attorneys. So I will include this question for the live Q&A, and it'll actually be really interesting because we'll have a chance to hear both the Pennsylvania and New York attorney give their response. And as all of you who've been in on those biweekly live Q&A calls with the attorneys, it's really interesting because you've all observed, I'm sure, that there's quite a difference in some cases between how Pennsylvania law applies and how New York State law applies, with New York typically being the most restrictive. So I'll review with you the question that was asked, and you can gear up to be excited to hear the answer, which I'm excited to hear as well, because this is quite quite complex, and we'll look forward to hearing the response live next week. So the question is, I have an employee who notified us of a self-quarantine, and our HR department asked the employee to get tested for COVID-19. The employee was told to contact HR back when they received the results. The employee was placed on COVID-19 sick pay during this time, and the employer reached out, so, we as the employer reached out on the 5th and 6th day for an update. We left voicemail messages both times, but we didn't hear any contact back from the employee. So we had the supervisor reach out on the 7th day, and the employee ended up calling into HR stating, hey, I heard that someone was trying to get a hold of me. HR asked about the test results to the employee, and they were negative. HR asked about coming back to work. The employee asked what they would need to do. HR explained that they would need a release to come back to work, and also asked them to give their medical provider permission to share the results. The employee agreed to do so. HR received the results of the test on the 7th day. HR reached out to the doctor's office. The doctor's office stated that the employee never asked for a release and never asked for the release to come back to work, but however, they would be released on the 7th day. HR explained to the doctor's office. So basically, obviously, the employee didn't do what they were supposed to do, right? So now the employer is in a predicament, and now they're explaining to the doctor's office that they need this documentation. However, HR never received the release. So once again, HR contacted the doctor's office, and they requested it. Still didn't receive it. They found out after trying to contact the employee for the update that the employee may actually have been notified of the test results on day 4 from the doctor's office. However, keep in mind, they continued to stay out beyond day 4. So the question the employer had was, what do I do in this situation? Can I find out definitively from the doctor's office when the employee received the test results? If we do find out that the employee received the results but did not contact us, and we're still being paid for COVID pay past their notified date, could that be considered theft of company payroll? A very interesting question with a lot of potential legal implications, which now you can understand why I said in the beginning of this webinar, I'm not interested in pretending to be an attorney, and we don't want to play attorney here at Decision Associates, but what we do is put you in touch with attorneys who can answer these questions. So that's a really good tee up for the question, for at least one of the questions that will be asked during next week's live Q&A. This would be a great time for me to also remind everybody, if you have more questions, please get in touch with me, get in touch with Erin. Our contact information is right here. You're going to all be receiving an email with the survey that will really be valuable to us as you provide your input and what it is you'd like to see as we continue beyond these weekly webinars that once again will end after this month. So please keep an eye out for that email with the online survey. And last but not least, please keep those compliance questions coming. Some of you have sent me compliance related questions and still haven't received an answer this week. You sent them within the past few days. That's because I'm still working on getting the answers. I know I copied all of you who've sent me those questions in on the communication with the appropriate attorney attorney who practices in the state where you operate. So, you know, as long as you grant permission, we'll continue to share those questions with the larger group. And certainly you'll see those reflected live with our New York and Pennsylvania attorneys next week. Thank you so much. Have an amazing week. And I really look forward to having the opportunity to connect with those of you who do so throughout each week. And certainly we'll see you next week. Have a great weekend.